Hey, what's going on, guys? Realm Gaming here, back in another video. Today's episode, we'll be taking a look at a balanced Druid for Mythic Plus in Season 1 of the War Within. So let's go ahead and dive into some of their strengths and weaknesses. Starting out with their strength, they have some of the strongest Mythic Plus utility in the game. I would put them up there with Elemental Shaman or Enhancement Shaman. They might even be better than Shaman, but it's definitely probably those two taking the top two spots. And we'll go over all the utility that they bring here in just a minute. Just a few notable ones, right? They have Mark of the Wild, giving us that percent damage increase and then that 1.5% damage reduction to our party. So that's going to be extremely nice. And then we also have Nature's Vigil on a 1.5 minute cooldown. So in a very high Mythic Plus key, this is going to be something that you can press pretty much on cooldown. You can press it on each pool of each individual pack as well, because each pack isn't dying in 10 seconds in a high key, right? So you're able to line this up pretty much with every single pack pull, and it's really good on that initial pull where there's a lot of healing that's needed. And then we have probably one of the strongest AOE damage profiles in the game at the moment, especially if you do play with a tank who pulls multiple packs. That's where they really start to shine with their sort of overlapping starfalls. And this is going to be one of the main benefits to playing or bringing a balanced Druid, is they can just absolutely cleave down entire packs very quickly. Now, on the flip side of that, they do have some pretty glaring weaknesses. One of the main ones is going to be their weak single target damage. So while they do have great AoE damage, in the single target damage department, they're not quite as good. So depending on your group's playstyle, you might want to bring somebody who can really hone in on single target damage, more funnel damage, because balanced Druid isn't going to be super great at that. Another weakness is, sure, we do have great AoE damage, but that does take a little bit of ramp time. You do have to spread out a whole bunch of different dots. You have to get multiple stacks of your Starfall rolling. You have to build up Astral Power. You just got a lot of different things that you have to be able to set up before you start seeing that high damage. So if a pack isn't living longer than like 30 seconds, you're probably not getting the full damage out of something like a balanced Druid. Okay, going into Mythic Plus utility, I'm not going to name absolutely everything just because there's so much. Some of the notable ones are going to be like our Solar Beam and our Typhoon. So Solar Beam is going to work as our group AoE silence. And then you can pair your Typhoon with an Ursul's Vortex. So if you Ursul's Vortex before you Typhoon, you can push all the mobs out with your Typhoon, and then the Vortex will kind of suck them back in so that you're not messing up the mob or the pack density. So there's a whole bunch of macros out there for doing that, putting in Typhoon and Ursul's Vortex into one button. So I highly recommend to do that. And then we also have our Incap Roar as well. So this is going to be an AoE Disorient. So based on what we've talked about already, Solar Beam, Typhoon, and Incap Roar, we have 3 AoE interrupts. So this is one of the reasons why we said that Balanced Druid has so much group utility. I mean, they just have a ton of tools at their kit to be able to reduce healing that's needed. Okay, let's go over some just general tips on how to even play Balanced Druid. So one of the main things you want to do is you want to avoid capping your Astral Power at all costs. So Astral Power is going to be your main primary resource. And really your main goal as Balanced Druid is to build up this Astral Power. And the reason we want Astral Power is because that allows us to spend it on our spenders, our hard-hitting abilities like Star Surge and Starfall. So if you do go over your cap, you are quite literally just wasting damage. And this is probably going to be the #1 mistake that most beginner Balanced Druids make, is capping on their Astral Power, going over a cap on their Astral Power and just throwing damage completely out the window. Your next priority is going to be to just try to dot everything up. And the reason for this is due to our Mastery Astral Invocation, as we just do more damage to mobs that have both Moonfire and Sunfire applied to them. So we'll go over this a little bit more once we get into the rotation section. Just know that a lot of your damage is kind of stored behind Moonfire and Sunfire and getting those dots out. And then the final thing we're going to go over here is your Eclipse uptime. And the reason you always want to be inside of an Eclipse is due to Star Surge and Starfall dealing something called Astral Damage. So Astral Damage will benefit both Eclipse types. So that's going to be Lunar and Solar. So if you have any abilities that deal Astral Damage, that means they benefit from both Lunar and Solar damage. And that's one reason we always want to be inside of an Eclipse, is because our Lunar Eclipse will give us Arcane damage and our Solar Eclipse will give us Nature damage. So anything that is Astral damage, which is our main spenders, are going to benefit from both of those Eclipse types. Now, typically, the Solar Eclipse is going to be better for single target damage, and your Lunar Eclipse is going to be better for AoE damage. So for single target encounters, make sure that you are prioritizing your solar eclipse, and then for AoE encounters, make sure you're prioritizing your lunar eclipse. Now, one of the main things that we do want to note here is lunar calling in our hero talent tree. So lunar calling is going to force you into a lunar eclipse. So this is really nice because now we're not having to think about going in between solar and lunar eclipses. It means anything that benefits from astral damage is always going to be getting that damage bonus from us being in an eclipse. Now, what this also means is that this is going to beef up our Starfire to the point where Wrath is no longer a button that we're prioritizing. So even in single target scenarios, we will always be pressing Starfire. So again, we'll get into that a little bit more once we go into the rotation, but while we're on the topic of eclipses, just know there has been some changes. Okay, let's go ahead and get into our opener. So number one priority is going to be to cast your Wrath 2 times so that we can get into that lunar eclipse. Again, since we are taking the lunar calling talent, we can only go into a lunar eclipse. Then from here, we're going to be dotting all targets that we possibly can. This is going to be to apply our mastery. So ensure that you are spreading Moonfire and Sunfire and everything around you. Our next priority is going to be to cast Fury of Elune. So Fury of Elune is going to be very important to us because it's going to generate us astral power. And you want to make sure that you are casting it before your celestial alignment so that we can get the haste into our Fury of Elune that we're getting from celestial alignment. So we're trying to funnel some damage into Fury of Elune. And when we do celestial alignment, we're going to make sure that the dots are up first before we press it, again, so that we can funnel more damage into those dots. Then from here, with all that astral power that we have generated, we have a choice. We could spend it on Star Surge, or we can spend the astral power on Starfall in 2 or more target scenarios. Then once we dump that initial astral power, then we can go into something like a Warrior of the Elune so that we can get instant cast Starfire procs, and we can build a whole bunch of more astral power to then spend, leading to a pretty solid overall opener. Then from here, due to the lunar calling talent putting us permanently into that lunar eclipse, we will just be pressing Starfire in all scenarios. Doesn't matter if it's 1 target, 2 targets, 10 targets, Starfire will be taking priority as your main builder. Then from here, we can go into single target or AOE priority. Okay, now let's take a look at the single target priority. So very similar to our opener, we have Moonfire and Sunfire. We're going to make sure that we're keeping those up at all times. Now, one thing that has changed is the fact that we're going to now have to refresh these dots. On the opener, you don't have to refresh. It's just the opener. You do it 1 time, then you go to your other priority lists. So now in single target priority, there's going to be situations where we have to refresh these dots. So typically, you want to be refreshing these dots once they get below 30% of their base duration. This is going to ensure that you're getting the most ticks out of the dot you possibly can while having to put less globals into it. So typically at about 6 seconds or less, you want to be looking to reapply Moonfire and Sunfire. Then going into your main cooldowns, so you want to be using Fury of Elune right before we use our Celestial Alignment, again, so that we can get that haste benefit from Celestial Alignment being kind of funneled into Fury of Elune. And then Celestial Alignment will also funnel all that haste into our Moonfire and Sunfire as well. So ensure that you have everything up and rolling before you press Celestial Alignment. Now from here, we want to be casting Warrior of Elune next to get those instant cast Starfires. And the reason we'll be pressing Warrior of Elune here is because Starfire is going to actually buff our next Wrath cast. So as we are starting to get out of that lunar eclipse and we kind of go back towards the middle in between the 2 eclipses, we have to get back into a lunar eclipse by casting 2 Wraths. So the lunar calling talent doesn't keep you in a lunar eclipse, it just doesn't build towards a solar eclipse anymore, if that makes sense. So you will have to constantly put yourself back into a lunar eclipse as you sort of recede towards the middle in between the 2 eclipse states. So going back to Warrior of Elune, the reason we press Warrior of the Elune here is so that we can get those Starfires out. And since you are still in an eclipse technically, those Starfires will benefit or beef up your next 2 Wraths that you cast as you're getting back into a lunar eclipse. So we want to get as much damage as we can into those 2 Wraths when we do cast them. Then step 5 here, we will cast those 2 Wraths, of course, to get back into the lunar eclipse. We cannot go into the solar eclipse. And then another thing that you will want to track is something called your Star-Lord. So this is pretty easy to keep stacked in single target scenarios, but that is one thing you do not want this to fall off. It stacks up to 3 times, and basically your Star Surge and Starfall are going to grant you 2% haste stacking to 3 for 6% total haste. So that is something that you do want to keep an eye on. So keep up those 3 stacks and don't cap on astral power. And then finally, you're going to build up more astral power with your Starfire spam. Then taking a look here at the AOE rotation priority, everything thankfully stays the exact same as it did in single target. The only thing that changes is spending Starfall versus Star Surge. But just in case you skipped the section, we're just going to quickly go over it again. We want to keep Moonfire, Sunfire up, and we want to ensure that we are within that pandemic window when we are refreshing Moonfire and Sunfire. Then we want to cast Fury of the Loon, and we want to ensure that we have all dots up and that Fury of a Loon is rolling before we go into step 3, our Celestial Alignment, to get that additional haste, kind of all being funneled into Moonfire, Sunfire, and Fury of the Loon. And actually, step 4 does change here a little bit. Really, you can send Warrior of a Loon at any time that you want. You don't have to ensure. It's not as important to buff your next 2 Wraths with the 2 cast of Starfires. It's probably going to be more optimal to send a Starfire early because, you know, as targets start to die and fall off, we want to ensure that we are casting Starfires while those mobs are alive rather than, you know, saving Warrior of the Loon to beef up 2 Wrath casts. So hopefully that makes sense. Then as you start to recede back in between your eclipses, you're going to cast 2 more Wraths to get back into that lunar eclipse again, spend astral power on Starfall, and then build with Starfire. Okay, then kind of cutting to the chase here on secondary stats, we are running Elun's Chosen, so it's going to be Intellect over Haste, over Mastery, over Critical Strike, then finally Versatility. Haste is typically going to be, you know, your number 1 secondary stat on a class like Balanced Druid because you get more dot ticks with something like Haste. So, you know, you're spreading out a bunch of Moonfires, Sunfires, you have procs of your Starfall going out. So the more haste, the more that happens. So the more damage, you just scale better with haste. And then pretty similar story with our Mastery here. So you just do flat out more damage to targets that have Moonfire and Sunfire on them. So that scales very well in AoE scenarios. And then we typically take Critical Strike over Versatility if you're wanting more damage. If you're wanting more survivability, you can put Versatility at the number 4 spot rather than something like Critical Strike, just kind of depending on what you're going for. But typically we recommend Critical Strike over Verse as the final 2 secondary stats. And then a quick look here at the talents that we will be running. There will be an import string in the description of the video. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for hanging around towards the end of the video. If you guys want to support the channel, there is a Patreon link in the description of the video. And if you learned something from the video, if you just enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We'll see you on the next one.